Hey everybody, welcome to Q Plus EDU. My name is Frederick, my pronouns are they, them. I am Out Youth Texas Gender and Sexuality Alliance Network Coordinator, and I will be doing the recording for tonight's session. So don't worry about privacy though, only the folks who are currently on camera will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about that. And I will pass it over to E.
Hi everyone, I'm E. I use they, them pronouns. I am the founder of Q Plus EDU. I'm here today mostly to moderate the chat. So if anyone has questions, drop those in the chat. And then also if you, throughout the presentation, if there are any links that are mentioned, any resources, anything like that, I will drop those in the chat as well, and they'll be posted on the website after this presentation. But with that, I will turn it over and let our presenter introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ames Zaki, he, him pronouns. I'm a educator in Seattle, Washington. I'm originally from California, and I'm very excited to be here. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody.
Okay, can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So unfortunately, it won't let me fully present, but at least we can see the slides now. Yeah, so if you want to go ahead and get started, or
yeah,
cool. That totally works. Thank you so much. As long as everyone can see generally what I'm trying to show, that works well for me. So just as my title, again, is Children's Agency Over Gender Through Art. If we want to go to the next slide. So a little bit about what I will be talking about today. So I'll start with an introduction of how I got here, what I'll be speaking about, a little bit, a few definitions, and then I'll talk about kind of the foundation of where these ideas came from, what the thesis that I wrote, that and the activists and writers that I studied from, that my thesis formed from. And then I will talk about my experience in the first job that I had outside of college, where I applied these ideas, and what strategies and themes that I found from this, and then the conversations and findings that happened, and then I'll conclude. And go to the next slide. So as an introduction, just to define what I'm speaking about again, so defining agency of gender through art is describing the belief of a child's freedom to determine their own person, and that an educator's choice is to guide, not control that determination, and it can help create spaces of such freedom. And what I'll be speaking from, of course, is as the educator of what guidelines and kind of more of a looser skeleton to a curriculum that created more child leadership, more conversations about comfort and consent and their own individual lives and their communities. Yeah, how all of that guidance translated to students, basically. We can go to the next slide. So a little background in studies. We can go to the next one. That's more of a title. Again, starting with a couple explanations or a couple definitions. This was what my thesis was about when I was going to college, which was Seattle University in Seattle, Washington. So my thesis was on intersectional pedagogy, which illustrates the ways in which educators should frame their curriculum using an intersectional feminist lens that centers liberation in those that are most marginalized and erased. So that is basically the guideline and the skeleton I'm speaking about, that expresses that liberation basically is students know who they are. Students are people that choose their own lives and their own individuals, and are working in communities. And that as an educator, having a curriculum like that is most beneficial and necessary. And we can go to the next slide. Just a last definition to give on child agency. I've kind of discussed what it means for a child to have agency, but to say a little bit more about why that's needed. is specifically because the opinions, the positionality of children is often not, they're not allowed to express themselves openly, as like they are often victims of abuse and power, especially within school spaces and education spaces. And it's extremely important to recognize those and fight against that. And so creating guidelines centering their intersections and their own individual and community findings and choices creates space for said agency. So that is more like that is what my thesis on. It was actually based for like an 11th grade U.S. history class. So kind of translating it to what would be art later was kind of an interesting challenge that I hadn't taken on before. The basis of where this thesis comes from really centers in Black liberation, trans visions, and the radical imaginary. To describe a little bit more about this, I chose a quote from Dr. Robin Kelly, who is an American historian, and he wrote a book called Freedom Dreams. And in this book, he is really having a conversation about what it means to still dream, to still like have the ideas like consistently flowing like throughout generations, and ideas of like revolution and liberation. Another piece of this that really I centered on in this thesis and in this was transcentric or transvisions. And this specifically, transvisions talks about like embracing gender as a mosaic and moving on like these matrices of oppression, whilst like centering lived experiences. And like being transcentric really like focuses on like centering those that are most marginalized and centering something that is where everyone deserves life, and this centering like others' contextual lived experiences. So by embracing gender as a mosaic, it's quite fluid. It's something that's messy, and that was something that was really important when kind of moving away from the structure that I often saw when I was in teaching spaces and educational spaces and in schools. And the last piece that was really a center of this thesis was the radical imaginary, which is kind of a culmination of these ideas in Black liberation and a transcentric view of dreams being and that are being put into actions toward creating the world you want to see, or performing utopia is a kind of a phrase to use for it. And we can move to the next slide. So moving on to the experiences, you know, a lot of this was my like I was in school, I was doing a lot of reading. It was something that was very in my head. Oops, my screen disappeared. Okay, there we go. And I was very excited and felt very challenged once I got my first job out of college, to put these into action, have my own dreams into action. We can go to the next slide. So a little bit about like where I was working. So I was working for a nonprofit after school program that is in Seattle, Washington. So this was based around like Capitol Hill, Seattle, at an elementary school. So it was kids ages 5 to 12. And I was there for probably around 4 to 5 hours a day, um, working with students who had just gotten out of school. Um, and I really noticed like right off the bat, there was a short and like stacked amount of time available for students to decompress from the school day while still engaging with other students, engaging in their own community, working on their schoolwork. I think something I saw right off the bat, like within this, was kind of disorganization and a lack of support with their art projects. I was kind of just asked in like spur of the moment if I could take on like the art project for the day, and I really noticed this like it was something that they didn't have enough people and enough support, or enough like intention focusing specifically on like certain pieces of like the flow of the day. You know, in this context, the art program, that it really did feel like it didn't flow with like what they were really trying to do in that program, and felt very thrown together. I felt kind of thrown together, and I think it definitely like translated to the students, in ways that they couldn't necessarily be intentional, in that kind of space. So those were observations I made. We can go to the next slide. So as I saw this, I definitely saw things that I felt needed, um, some creative ideas, some creative solutions, and that it was really an opportunity, to possibly make some change that could be really helpful for that program. So these are some of the strategies and themes, that I came up with. So kind of this is a pretty basic idea of what went forward into these strategies for their art curriculum. Was first starting out, which I think is always a good foundation, to have a clean space and an organization of all of the supplies. I think even then, like starting there were some pieces missing. Afterwards, soft skills is another strategy that I will discuss a little bit more. Guided templates, for every day for each art project, and then translating that into the freedom and agency that I was, translating from like, my work in school into the classroom setting. I wrote this in big text because I think it's really important. Clean space and supplies, like organizing the supplies available. Things were really messy. Things were kind of all over the place. We couldn't see what we had for students each day. And having a clear and clean space to begin projects, that wasn't kind of filled with the messes of, um, teachers who were throwing things together in the moment, gave the students room to like create their own ideas, or make their own messes. I think whether it was physically or kind of, mentally, they were kind of having to move around. Teachers kind of going in the moment, like, oh, okay, let's do this, or oh, let me grab these things, or I don't know if I have this. And just starting with that, like, here I have all of these things ready, was kind of a really good foundation. And then we can go to the next slide. The next piece that I think was really big was, the themes. Now, these were the soft skills I was talking about, and this is really where I made that connection, into like the flow of the classroom space of that after school program. The director of that program really, encouraged soft skills, which was, each week we would talk about, as some examples I gave below, of talking about a student's expression, talking about what it means to have respect, to respect yourself, and another one, friendship. You know, these are just a few examples. Like each week, we focused on something that, for like conversation to have throughout that week, and I wanted to loop art projects in any way that I could, because I thought that that kind of really brought things together, just like something that was really important, and kind of again create that structure, that lets students have like conversations themselves. And then we can go to the next slide. And my screen keeps disappearing.
So this slide is templates. Did we lose you?
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
So sorry. My computer's acting a little bit funny. Uh, so I'll start over a little bit. So this was the next piece afterwards. The soft skills was the templates. So I gave a few examples of templates that I created. I gave a little bit more of a rundown on the side because they seem to be a little hard to see. But I created these templates each week. I would have 4 to 5 ready before the before Monday, and I really tried to base it in like the context of the classroom, meaning who was in the classroom, what was going on in the world, in their own space, in their school. And also and to like what that theme of the week was specifically. And within these templates, I created these to make sure that anyone could do these projects. This wasn't just something that one person or that I was able to like kind of activate in that space because I didn't think that was necessarily sustainable. So I try to have as many I try to have a really good breakdown of what was needed, how long the project would run, specifically what materials needed to be had, detailed instructions, an example photo, as well as a sample of the project that I would make the night before. So students could not only they could read the template themselves, or they could look at the example, or they could see visually like what I'd created as something that they could possibly make, something that I had those guidelines around. They could touch it, they could feel it, they could see very like closely like what the idea was. And then lastly, I would have like a things to know, whether they were tasks that needed to be specifically done by the adults in the classroom, or ways to like shift among age range was I felt really important, because again it was like 5 to 12 years old, 40 to 60 students in a class. So there was definitely a lot of range to really take in consideration while trying to do like one project per day. There definitely wasn't like that kind of separation. So if we can go to the next slide. So all of these pieces, all of these kind of building blocks um, that I built, that is what created this freedom and agency that I really encouraged and that I did actually see. And so I every day when I would go, we would have our circle time, we would talk about what's going on today and what the project is. And often students would ask like, well, do I have to make this? And I would always say, I've provided these supplies and these guidelines. Now create what comes to you. I really encourage students to seek and consider themselves as agents of their own person through their art. So exploring whatever that meant to them, that they could try to do the project exactly as the sample I had created, but I encouraged them to explore like whatever the guide, like kind of the guideline, the theme I was going off of, like attached to like an art project with the supplies that I had. So oftentimes like kids would make something completely different or something of their own imagination, that really like illustrated to me that it was like their own really incredible ideas that were really turning in their heads, and it was so exciting to see. So this is where I came to my findings. So after doing all of these things, um, I really saw some pieces come together, or things that I was hoping to see. If we can go to the next slide. So specifically in connection to gender, um, with the freedom of these guidelines, I found children gained agency and chose themselves more freely without a need to meet certain expectations. So I really noticed this dominantly through like the conversations that were had at the table. I saw a different range of genders like coming to the space. That I think art is often, or at least in the space that I was in that school, it was very gendered. Um, you know, for girls. I say that in quotes. The school was still very binary. It was still often felt like very segregated among their genders, of where there were these spaces for one group and spaces for another. And art space was where supposedly the girls were supposed to go. And so I saw a range of students that I hadn't seen before when starting. As like the months went on, I saw a different range of age. That students that were 5 years old could do the project, and students that were about to leave to go to middle school could do the project. And we had conversations specific to gender, of talking about in some examples of the templates that I showed a bit earlier. There was, the theme was expression, and I had a template that was about pronoun pins. Something I think that was simple, but it really started a conversation around what like felt comfortable to a student. And it was really exciting to see like students that were 6, 7, 8 years old talking about talking about neopronouns, talking about like what felt comfortable to them. It also moved to conversations about what they looked like. And students would talk about like what it meant to, if you had long hair, if that meant you were a girl or a boy. And students say, well, I have long hair and I'm not a girl. And some of those things like just started popping up like as that guideline kind of flowed. And it was, I loved to see it. And I loved being able to facilitate those conversations. You can go to the next slide. So gender is of course like what I'm specifically focusing on here, but there are obviously very many intersections, and in that like messy mosaic that make up who a person is, individually and in their community. And so while I saw a lot of conversations or ways to like structure my guideline around like an agency of gender, I also really saw it in other ways. So there was, the first one right off the bat was in talking about ability. Students were really able to adjust projects to what fit for them while still challenging themselves to explore across their ability or their age. And again, like I've spoken about, like whether they were 5 to 12 years old, but also students that were on the spectrum that were maybe uncomfortable with certain textures, or there was working on their own motor skills, and like what fit best for them. And on top of that, as students were kind of naming like what they needed, other students assisted each other. Like they rose their hand and asking if they could, move around to help another student once like those adjustments were made. And that really promoted a lot of like, I wasn't the person, of course I was always there, but students were taking the lead. And I thought that was really illustrating like their own agency to make those choices. A couple other intersections that I saw especially come up was specifically in like race and culture, especially like as I was focusing templates on the context within Black History Month, if it was Lunar New Year, if it was, those are very small, like, those are things that were, happening throughout the school year, but I didn't feel that were also being like focused in an after school program. So like focusing those projects, like wrapping it into that, where students started discussing like how they saw themselves, who they connected to in their communities. A project that came with that seemed to really start those conversations was making their own self-portraits out of clay, and having paint available to paint what they looked like, shape out who they are. Students spoke to each other about their own traditions and their lives and the connection with the projects. And lastly, there was this kind of connects a little bit with the ability in the way these conversations formed. But there was a big conversation of consent when there was space made available for conversation about like what felt safe and what they wanted to do like within the time that we had. There were more tools available to meet them at those needs because the structure wasn't focused on, you need to make like this, this product at a certain point, like, in the next like 30 to 45 minutes. It was, this is what I have available today. These are some ideas that we're focusing on this week. What does that mean to you? How does that connect to you today or in your life, or uh, what happened at school? So if we go to the next slide. So kind of in conclusion, so I really found that with these ideas that I focused on in my thesis and really putting them into action in a classroom, the writings of intersectional pedagogy into an artistic practice opened up a curriculum led by student agency, personal experiences, and creativity, all with their center on their own personal agency to choose themselves and be people. And I think that's the last slide. Are there any questions from anybody or anything I can go back to?
Thank you so much. That was really awesome. I love the way you like broke it down and walked us through like your process, your observations, like what worked, what didn't work. What can you tell us about like a piece of art that you found really impactful? Like maybe, maybe the student didn't necessarily think that it was, it wasn't particularly moving for them, or it wasn't necessarily like great art, but something that you were really moved by?
Yeah, I think something that I this was actually very close to when the pandemic really hit, and the schools, they were worried that the schools were going to shut down. There'd also, and with a little more context, there'd just been a lice outbreak. So there was a lot going on and students were very stressed. So I focused that last week on self-care, on checking in with yourself, on focusing on your body. And we made little stress balls out of flour and balloons and markers and yarn. It was a fun and messy project that kids could kind of um, uh, shift their focus a little bit. But at the end of the project, there was a student that had tears in her eyes actually, because she spoke a little bit about that. It really felt good to have something to hold throughout the day, that when she was feeling stressed, and having basically like her own fidget to keep in her bag throughout this time. And I found that I was so happy that that could be helpful in that moment, um, and really focused like on her own like personal safety and her own agency of herself, and that was really exciting to see.
That's awesome. That's so sweet to be able to see like the immediate results like that, where it's like I made this thing and it's useful and I'm really grateful for it. Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's one of those moments that you don't always get to see,
absolutely.
and it was so great to be able to like be there and see it like with my own eyes.
Yeah. We have moved Out Youth's drop-in services to be virtual since COVID hit, and our youth, like most queer youth, are really into art, and so at least once a week we do an art project. And early on, we're in Texas, so masks are not everybody's jam, unfortunately. But early on, one of the projects that they tried to do over Zoom was like make your own mask, like as an art project. And sewing and things like that were really
Yeah.
challenging. I don't know how successful the mask making was, but we heard from a lot of the youth that it was really helpful for them to center the idea of mask making on protecting the community and protecting their friends. And so it was like tying their art to this purpose of like, you know, we're doing this for a reason because we want to be able to see our friends again and we want everybody to be safe and healthy. And so we're going to make masks and we're going to wear masks because we love other people. And so
Yeah.
that was one of my favorite like art stories at Out Youth.
That's really cool. I actually thought about like buying masks for like the summer camp itself for them to make their own, because they, you know, it was 20 students in the summer program that had to wear masks every day. And being able to like at least choose like what it looked like on their face, like was something that was you know, cool to think about.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't remember if we've uploaded it on the website or not yet, but the panel that we did last week or the week before on LGBTQ plus immigration activism, the two panelists that we had are actually both like professional artists. And so they were talking about how they use their art for like political statements and to make connections in the community and things like that. And so I love the fact that like we're getting the youth started young in being able to express themselves in ways that are creative and thoughtful and impactful for like not just themselves but for, you know, the people in their community too.
Yeah, definitely. Again, this was a little bit later in the summer program, but we ended up having just within a project, again, with just the supplies available, students just started making their own posters, their own Black Lives Matter posters, their own Black Power posters, asking questions about protests, talking about their own experiences. It was definitely like something I was like hoping to see, and kind of like them being able to like express themselves. And I'm really excited it was a conversation that could be had like with all of the students there.
That's awesome. I think, yeah, art, you know, the idea of like the starving artist is really pervasive, but there's a lot of different ways to do art and a lot of different things that people can do with art. I recently just watched the comedian Hannah Gadsby. I just watched both Nanette and Douglas, and her background as like an art history major, like if you haven't seen Douglas, highly recommend. Not necessarily appropriate for children, but really wonderful queer comedy. Like,
yeah. I enjoy her a lot. Yeah.
So, since we're talking about queer art in many various forms, who are some of your favorite queer artists? Like, when you think about queer artists who really kind of embody agency over gender in their art, who comes to mind for you?
Oh, absolutely. Right off the bat is drag performers here in Seattle. While I was in school, I ran a drag show every year for 3 years. And I got to, I feel so lucky to have connected with a lot of drag performers, a lot of kings, a lot of queens who came to our school. And like it opened my mind up to my own gender. It opened my mind up to different ways of expression, in the way that they dressed, in the way they talked about culture, in the way they talked about their bodies. And that's a huge inspiration to me when it comes to expressing my own art. It's not something I necessarily focused on until I started working. Again, like my thesis was about U.S. history. I'm a history major, so like art definitely is like within that, but it wasn't a focus, and so it really was applying kind of my own just like liking to be crafty and liking to do little projects like that that were kind of the start of those projects in the elementary school, that kind of shifted those ideas.
Yeah, E and I have had a number of conversations about makeup and gender and how
Mhm.
we wish everyone wore like full makeup, all not full makeup, but it was like I wish that everyone was like comfortable enough like playing with makeup to like
Yeah.
just to enjoy like what makeup can do without anyone feeling obligated to wear makeup. E is also an artist in their own right. E, I don't know if you want to jump on and talk a little bit about the, I, I don't even think you told me about it. I think Catherine told me about you were like dyeing fabric in your kitchen one night while they were, while you were talking with Catherine.
Yeah, so I did this AP Studio Art 3D class, and so you basically get a year to do a self-directed art project. And so I decided that I wanted to explore the intersections between sort of like Victorian era ideals of adornment and regality, and
Wow.
intersections between forms of adornment on American plantations. So I centered it around Queen Victoria's wedding because that was a really big shift in the way that we see fashion. So like
Definitely.
wedding dresses originated from Queen Victoria's wedding in the 1830s. And so as part of that, I sort of did research. I decided to focus on specifically West Africa and Yoruba traditions, which is one of the
Mhm.
major indigenous tribes in Nigeria. And so I ended up focusing on that because there was a lot of research on it, and I didn't have a lot of resources to do like in-depth research into lesser known cultures. And so I focused on those traditions and looking at the ways that they adorned themselves. There was a lot more playing with gender in those societies, as with a lot of other indigenous and native, like non-colonized societies.
Mhm.
Everyone's messing around with gender. It's white Westerners who enforced these constructs. Um, and so there's sort of this really big difference between the ways that people in those societies express gender through clothing and adornment and fashion and things, and the ways that there was expression among the upper class, the wealthy elites in Europe. And so for that collection, I ended up designing and making, there was a wedding dress, there was like a suit that was sort of a hybrid of Prince Albert's, that's who Queen Victoria married. So he wore this like really iconic red military jacket. And so I used that sort of and built an outfit around it. And it was a combination between that and some of the things you would see on slave plantations. So some slaves would be promoted to livery. They would get to wear livery coats and things. And so in that instance, they were almost like a personal assistant, sort of the way you would think of a chauffeur, but they didn't have cars. But it's that role of like a butler, personal assistant type person. And
Mhm.
so that was sort of the peak of what slaves were allowed to have or what they were allowed to wear, particularly in the South. And so I modeled what Prince Albert wore around livery coats. I made everything out of this unbleached canvas. And so as part of that, I ended up dyeing fabric and doing all of that. And so it was just really interesting to explore sort of not only the racial and cultural differences, but also the gender divides and the different ways in which people expressed all of that in Queen Victoria, where they had everything and it was beautiful and stuff, and then slaves on plantations trying to find means of expression when they often had little or weren't allowed to express themselves in the ways that they might have wanted to.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's so cool. I think that's especially why I like focused like the center of this work on Black liberation, on something that is transcentric, because focusing anything that is based in what the U.S. school system is now, which is based in colonization, which is based in focusing like white supremacy and Western culture, is that like the conversation can't even be had when you're talking about gender, because it's already in that binary, just as it was like as I walked into the classroom. Definitely.
No, this has been awesome. Definitely, if folks have questions, feel free to pop those in the chat or in the Q&A. And the video for this should be up in a week or two, hopefully sooner than that. But, and also, are you okay with us posting the slides?
Absolutely.
We can definitely add those as well. But yeah, if folks have questions, feel free to pop those in the chat. But yeah, this is awesome. I think like I saw a photo shoot today of someone who was basically like giving the middle finger to gender reveal parties, and just, you know, because gender. I really want people to start doing like astrological reveal parties, like, congratulations, it's a Leo. It'd be so much more fun.
If there aren't any questions that come on the chat, I'm super down to answer any. What happens afterwards? Does the recording end and it gets uploaded?
Yeah, so it'll take us a few days to a week-ish to upload it to our website. But then on our website, we'll have the recording, we'll have the slides, and then we'll have, if there's a list of resources that you'd like to send us, we can include those. You absolutely don't have to. And if you'd like to include your contact information, we can do that as well. Again, no pressure. You don't have to if you don't want to.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, if there aren't any other questions, then I am going to go ahead and plug tomorrow's conversation, which is decentering whiteness and queerness, on topic. So we definitely hope that you will join us for that. And then we also have 2 more final sessions on Monday before we close out Q+ EDU for this year. We're super grateful for y'all for joining us. We do also love to get feedback on our sessions. So E will drop the feedback form in the chat. Yeah, we thank you so much. We are really grateful for your time and energy here with us today, and we hope to see y'all tomorrow.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.